We're going to be talking about some of our Unitarian ancestors this morning, so I'd like to start with a brief moment of silence for all of our ancestors and our Unitarian ancestors. Well, thank you and good morning. If any of you watch Netflix or Amazon television series like I do, you understand how some of those television series, especially the political thriller ones, they get really complicated fairly quickly. So sometimes it's important to tune in early and hear, last week on such and such a show, this is what happened. So that's how we'll start this morning. 2 months ago, on the Process of UU History and Theology show, we discussed how process philosophy and Unitarian Universalism continue to evolve, working hard to not get bogged down in old creeds or doctrines or dogma or social theories of reality that are not supported by a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which is our fourth of 7 principles. The truth is always unfolding every day, forever in process, and we are a free faith, confident that our free and responsible search is done best in our local communities, honoring our humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, which is the 5th source of our principles. In that first session in September, we also reminded ourselves that our faith counsels us and warns us against the idolatries of the mind and spirit, again, the 5th source of our principles, and process philosophy adds to that list idolatries of science, which can sometimes devolve into the worship of science or scientism, excluding all other forms of knowing ourselves and the universe. We reviewed how process thought and process spirituality can be foundational to a Unitarian Universalist history and theology because it gives us a religion and a philosophy, a way of knowing the world and the universe that is credible for scientists, technologists, and religious humanists, in addition to folks seeking a spiritual path. Process philosophy was largely instigated and had its initial beginnings shaped by scientists and mathematicians. These philosophers saw God, and oftentimes religion, being paid metaphysical compliments to establish the authority of religion and the credibility of God, but that credibility did not hold up over time under the intense scrutiny of reason and logic and science, especially the science of physics. Now that's Unitarianism. The world is older than 2,000 years, despite what the biblical literalists might suggest. The emphasis on rational thought applied to religious texts is what initially drew me to Unitarian Universalism 27 years ago, when I was at worst a righteous, angry atheist, but also flirting with a sort of hopeful agnosticism that I didn't want to talk about, lest I be accused of being religious. It was a sort of don't ask, don't tell type of theology that I harbored in my heart of hearts. On our second episode in October of the Process of UU History and Theology show, we discussed Unitarian Christianity. And in the history of American religion, if there is one sermon that stands out in the shaping of American Protestant religion, it would not be the sermon Unitarian Christianity delivered by William Ellery Channing. No, the sermon that really stands out in American religious history would be Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, delivered by the famous Christian theologian Jonathan Edwards. That sermon provides a glimpse into a period of the United States known as the First Great Awakening, emphasizing the teaching that hell is real, the horrors awaiting those not following Jesus Christ are real, and that an all-powerful, and all-knowing God shall permit Satan to grasp the wicked and seize them as his own. People as sinners and God as an all-powerful and all-knowing God is exactly what Unitarians and Universalists protested against. In process theology, God is neither all-powerful nor omnipotent in the sense of being coercive. The process God is the great companion, the poet of the world, suffering with us, a spirit of spontaneous love that, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson, is available to all of us and not just a select few in history. The Christian Unitarians created a great controversy in 1805 when the Reverend Henry Ware from Hingham, Massachusetts, was elected to the Hollis Chair at Harvard University, and he was suspected of having Unitarian views. Because he did. He did have Unitarian views. Ware was instrumental in the formation of the Harvard Divinity School, which became so Unitarian and liberal in its teachings that the more conservative members of the university and the Congregational churches of New England split off and created the theologically conservative Andover Theological School in Andover, Massachusetts, on the campus of Phillips Academy, my hometown. I didn't know that when I was doing some of this research. The Unitarian ministers and scholars of the early days of Harvard Divinity School were extremely dedicated to their application of logic and reason to any exercises concerning the interpretation of the Bible. They became the experts in biblical hermeneutics, or how to interpret the Bible using reason and logic. These liberal and literary Unitarian scholars and ministers brought an incredibly large volume of scholarship to Harvard and Cambridge that was also incredibly boring. These are the people you run away from at cocktail parties, lest you get another earful of biblical hermeneutics. I really encourage this congregation not to have biblical hermeneutics as a primary draw for any Apple employees that might be interested in this church. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm not the only one that feels that a focus on biblical hermeneutics can be, well, kind of boring. The era of Unitarian liberal Christianity at Harvard lasted barely a generation before Ralph Waldo Emerson and his merry band of transcendentalists burst into the show. Emerson left the Unitarian ministry to strike out on his own and declared in the opening sentences of his Transcendentalist Manifesto, which was titled simply Nature, the previous generations beheld God and nature face to face, but we see through their eyes. Why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy and songs of insight of our own, and not of tradition, and not of a religion revealed to us by a minister of the Bible? Emerson and the Transcendentalists represent a spirituality still available to us that involves the sensing parts of ourselves, our communities, and our world that transcend rational thought and hermeneutics of any text, including the Bible. Years ago, I used to pick my son up from middle school, and we would meet right in front of this giant maple tree. Sometimes his eyes would lock on mine from a distance as he was looking for me, and this huge, giant smile would break across his face, and my heart would fill with joy when I saw his eyes. And it's those moments that escape simple description that the Transcendentalists want us to connect to. They're not rational. Emerson wrote this in his Oversoul essay: "There is a difference between one and another hour of life in their authority and subsequent effect. Our faith comes in moments, our vices are habitual." I'm going to say that one again. Our faith comes in moments, but our vices are habitual. Yet there is a depth in those brief moments which constrains us to ascribe more reality to them than to all other experiences. I don't know about you, but I have lived some of those moments, and I want more. Unitarian Universalist scholar David Robinson had this to say about the Transcendentalists. Like a pauper who searches for the next meal, never knowing of the relatives whose will would make him rich, American Unitarians lament their vague religious identity, standing upon the richest theological legacy of any American denomination. Possessed of a deep and sustaining history of spiritual achievement and philosophical speculation, religious liberals have been ironically dispossessed of that heritage. Robinson argues that on the one hand, we're troubled by a sense of the vagueness of our religious identity, and we hold an uneasy conception of ourselves as marginal, perhaps among the established American denominations. On the other hand, like many other churches and young adults, we're looking for a greater sense of spirituality in our lives. In Robinson's words, this spirituality is a feeling or hunger for a deeper inner life and a more profound experience of the world that we share. We're haunted by the specter of our own superficiality, the uneasy feeling that life is sliding by and leaving no deep mark on us, that we're being cheated of some version of real experience that would add marrow to the dry bones of our daily routine. We've found ways of dealing with this hunger, many of them unhealthy, I think, and masking it, but we found it has a curious persistence. In many respects, Transcendentalism was a generational revolt from Unitarianism, which itself had split off from Calvinism only a generation before. The Unitarian Christians had broken with the Orthodox Christians on largely rational grounds. And now the Transcendentalists were protesting a lack of religious feeling and enthusiasm among the Unitarians because of an exaggerated rationalism. As Theodore Parker expressed it, I felt early that the liberal ministers did not do justice to simple religious feeling. To all their preaching seemed to relate too much to outward things, not enough to the inward mystical life. The cry was ever, duty, duty, work, work. They failed to address with equal power the soul, and did not also shout, joy, joy, delight, delight. Emerson famously added the label corpse-cold Unitarianism to a growing chorus of complaints about Unitarianism among the Transcendentalists. Last week, one of my process teachers, Jay McDaniel, quoted Frederick Buechner, using a quote that I've used many, many times before. And that quote is, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Jay then said something profound, at least to my ears. When I used that phrase in the past, it always made me think of the world's deep hunger. Whether it was climate change or social justice or my own sense of inadequacy in the face of deep despair. There seems to be an endless list of the world's deep hunger. Jay told our group that if you don't focus on people's deep gladness, you'll lose them to the world's deep hunger. And right now, I think our faith could use some focus on deep gladness. Our transcendentalist ancestors, like my process teachers, have convinced me it is impossible to describe God, spirituality, divine inspiration, or any similar concept in mere words. Traditional theologians try to divide explanations of the divine into two categories. The first is cataphatic. Cataphatic theology, which means we try to describe God using positive terminology. They would say God is love. Other traditional theologians disagree with that approach, and they say no words can fully grasp God's character. You can't talk about what God is. You can only say what God is not. They call this apophatic theology. God is not hateful. God does not exclude anyone. Apophatic, cataphatic, fancy theological jargon that I like, but again, not real popular at the cocktail parties. Instead of words, and theological jargon, the transcendentalists and process philosophy point us to experiencing the divine. For Emerson and Thoreau, it was experienced primarily in nature. I experienced it sometimes when I picked my son up from school. The writings of Emerson and Thoreau, especially Emerson's essay on nature and Thoreau's book, Walden Pond, have inspired generations of Americans who were not necessarily Unitarians. The Transcendentalists continue to appeal to all those who possess a reverential attitude towards nature, who are interested in ecological civilization and climate change, for people who have a strong ethical sensibility and a desire to live with greater spiritual intensity and depth. Now, I think maybe that's something that might resonate at a cocktail party. My teacher, Jay McDaniel, went to theological school at the same time with two powerful voices in Unitarian Universalist circles, Rebecca Parker and Thandeka. All three are proponents of connecting to the divine through art and music, something I think most of us can relate to. We all know songs that get stuck inside our heads, or when we hear them, remind us of significant moments in our lives, or they remind us of who we want to be and how we want to move in the world. I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got love like an ocean in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain in my soul, in my soul, in my soul. I believe that regardless of your skill level, there's a song inside of you that needs to be sung. I was listening to a preacher who shared about a radio interview she heard where the DJ was tasked with interviewing 5 famous singers. Afterward, the DJ was asked if he learned anything from the process. And he responded by saying, yes, don't die with your music still inside of you. How terrible it would be if we died with our music still inside of us. And now when I think of all those famous Unitarian Transcendentalists, it's a reminder to me that we don't sing alone. The list is long and distinguished in American history, and they were the American Renaissance, insisting on and creating an American culture separate and distinct from the prevailing European culture at the beginning of our country. Like many artisans, they created controversy wherever they traveled. They were poets and authors, ministers and educators, revolutionaries and women's rights advocates, abolitionists and musicians. Their names were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman and Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville and William Ellery Channing, Margaret Fuller and Frederick Douglass. The list goes on and on. They sang songs of hope and courage, of everyone having worth and dignity, of justice and compassion, of truth and meaning, of liberty and justice, of nature and the interdependent web of all existence. Most of all, I think they sang songs of a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. In closing, I hope that those of you who know and seek God will have the light and love of God shine upon you and emanate out from within you. For those of you who seek the good life, may the good life embrace you back. For all of us, may we remember that yesterday is but a dream and tomorrow is only a vision. But today, well lived, makes every yesterday a dream of happiness and every tomorrow a vision of hope. Live well, therefore, this day and every day.